Welcome to You Can Talk to Me, a Beatles podcast. It's time to make our way across the universe and talk all things John, Paul, George and Ringo.
Bruce, welcome along to the podcast. It's good to have you. This is episode 50, a special one for me and our listeners, so thank you for being our guest.
Glad to be here. I'm very honored to be here for such a milestone.
Much appreciated. Before we do get into talking...
And if this show were on the Ruddles, I would call it a millstone.
I see what you did there. That's very good.
Yes.
Oh, nice work. If that's setting the tone for everything to come, we're in a good place.
Absolutely.
If we go back in time, you've been very prolific as a Beatles author now for a number of years. And I'm just curious, before we even talk Beatles, when did that love of writing first come into your life?
Well, I used to be, particularly in high school, if I had to write a 200-word essay, I would freak out. But I became a lawyer, and as a lawyer, it's very important to be able to write pleadings in such a way that judges can follow them and understand them. So I think my legal and accounting background really honed my skills as a Beatles researcher and author.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Do you enjoy that process? You obviously do, of unearthing and digging in and seeing where one thread might pull to another?
Yeah, I mean, I love it, and what I find, and it's the same thing I find in law sometimes, is you start up with a case and you think you know where it's going, and then as the facts come in and you interview people and review documents, it goes somewhere else. And in my very first book, The Beatles Records on VJ, that happened. I mean, every book I had read said that Introducing the Beatles came out in the summer of 1963. And so I was starting my research from that point. But as I did research, I began to realize it did not come out in the summer of 63 and did not come out until early 1964, February 7. And the reason that I knew this was I had corporate minutes from VJ, the label that put out Introducing the Beatles, and the minutes talked about we can have the album out by Friday. And I think that meeting was on the 7th, so that meant the album would have been in stores by the 10th. And so word kind of got out in the Beatles collector's world, because I was a newbie back then. I wasn't an author. I was just a collector. And they said some crazy tax attorney in New Orleans is writing a book, and he claims Introducing the Beatles didn't come out till 1964. When everyone knows it came out in the 60, in 63,
Yeah.
This guy's crazy. And I said, and I would just tell people, wait till the book comes out. And when the book came out, I had proof of when it came out.
Was there an immediate turn in the sentiment around this crazy attorney out of New Orleans then?
Well, there was with one person, a wonderful guy, Wally Projojic, who wrote with Harry Castleman this book All Together Now, which was the first real book to talk about the Beatles records. And it was a trailblazing book. So I was at a Beatles convention in Chicago. The book had been out a few months. And this guy walks up to me and he says, I talked it over with my partner last night, and we believe we're right and you're wrong. And I said, okay, time out. First of all, who are you and who is your partner? And he told me. And then I said, I need a little help there. And then he said, we wrote the book All Together Now. And I said, oh, great. And I told him how much I enjoyed the book. And I said, look, before you cast judgment on me, I would like for you to read the following page. And I opened the book and I handed it to him, and he walked away. And about 10 minutes later, he came out waving a handkerchief and said, I surrender. How much is the book? And Wally and I have been great friends ever since.
That's a great story. Do you find that
he's a great person?
Yeah, no, those relationships are special when they happen like that. You must get a great sense of goodwill when you're talking to fans at fests and so on over the years that you've impacted through your work. What's that like for you?
It's really very flattering. And, I like pleasing people and that type of thing. And I'm happy to talk to people and give them my opinions. I think the most unique one was that it was shortly after the VJ book came out, and a group of Japanese people walked up to my table, and one of them spoke English and the others didn't. And he handed me a copy of Introducing the Beatles and asked me if it was legitimate, and if it was, could I explain why? And I did that to him, and he turned around and told the group of people with him what I had told them, but in Japanese. And when he was finished, they all applauded. And that was
Ah,
pretty unique.
yeah, isn't that great? That speaks to the universal sentiment of that band, doesn't it?
Yes.
That little nugget of information for a group of people that aren't even speaking the language are united by the universal language of music.
Yeah. I mean, you see Beatle tribute bands. I saw one from Japan. It might have been even the first Abbey Road on the River. And the first two songs, I mean, they were terrified. They were playing in the US, and then all of a sudden they kind of got into it and they really sounded great. And afterwards, I went over to talk to them, and none of them spoke a word of English, but a woman with them did speak English. But I thought, like, these guys really sing well in English for people that don't know English.
Yeah, it's fantastic. Could we
Yeah.
talk about your discovery of the Beatles? In doing some of my research, correct me if I'm wrong, but
Mhm.
I love the story that you shared, and perhaps we could dig into it here, about being seated on a bus in
Mhm.
'64 as a young boy and hearing a particular song. Could you just share that moment? I'm always fascinated to talk to people that were there in the
Yeah.
time.
Yeah, I was, I guess, eight or nine, and I'm on the Newman school bus going to school. And it's probably in the afternoon coming back from school. And I heard this song, and it just, there was something about it. It was exciting. It had the hand clapping, it had this middle section, and then it came back in full strength again, and it had a powerful ending. And the disc jockey said it was by a group called the Beatles, which didn't mean anything to me, of course. But I had a radio in my room, and during the week, I would hear the song more and on the school bus more, and just completely fell in love with the song. And then it wasn't long afterwards, because in the States, because She Loves You and Please Please Me had initially flopped, those records were re-released by VJ and Swan. And so all of a sudden, I'm not just hearing I Want to Hold Your Hand, but I'm also hearing She Loves You and Please Please Me,
Yeah.
all these great songs. And I was hooked. It was just, it didn't take long for me to get hooked.
Can you remember at all what the world of music felt like before that lightning bolt? Were you musically aware?
Oh
Did
yeah,
it seem
yeah.
like an extension of something else?
Yeah, I mean, I was listening to music at the age of 2. I had older sisters, and they had a radio in their bedroom. And supposedly my first two sentences were, Daddy, I want an ice cream cone, and Mommy, I want a radio. And my dad got me an ice cream cone. My mom got me a radio. So I had a radio in my room, and I would listen to music and absolutely loved it. But I didn't comprehend the way it was, because I didn't know really about records. And I thought that these groups of singers would go to a radio station and perform the song on the air, and then get in the station wagon and drive to another radio station. And then my sisters told me about records. And so they were 7 and 8 years older than me. And so I started listening to them. And then they had some good ones in there, Please Mr. Postman by the Marvelettes,
Yeah.
which the Beatles later did a fantastic cover on. But my favorite record of theirs was an album called The Coasters' Greatest Hits. And I permanently borrowed that record long ago. And my favorite group until the Beatles came along was the Coasters.
Yeah.
And what impressed me about the Coasters wasn't just how great the music was, but that almost all the songs on that album were written by the same two people, Jerry Stoller and Mike Lieber. And when I got Meet the Beatles and I looked at the back liner notes, I was always interested in those liner notes. I noticed that almost all the songs were written by John Lennon and Paul McCartney, and they were in the group. And that really impressed me.
I love the fact that as you're speaking, I'm listening to you, even as a little boy, you love looking at the detail. It's
Yeah,
here are the
yeah,
liner notes. What's the story underneath all of this? That's happening at a very early age by the sounds of things.
yeah,
When
absolutely.
when you look back at your body of work, and I'm sure there are many, but I'm just curious if you had to select you mentioned introducing the Beatles and the revelation of that release timing,
Mhm.
but what have been some of your favorite aha moments where you've gone down a trail and thought, you know what, have a look at this. That's unique. Do you have a couple that you could refer to?
Yeah, a couple, and a lot of some are just plain detective work. Like, for example, I had always wondered, as record collectors and Beatle fans have wondered for years, okay, we know that A Hard Day's Night comes out as a movie, and the soundtrack is on United Artists Records. And
Mm,
then in the United States, the soundtrack for Help is on Capitol Records. And what's that about? And so when I was doing the book, The Beatles for Sale to Help, which was the last book I've written in my Beatles album series, and and right now the last book,
Yeah.
that may change, but right now it's the last book.
Okay.
And in it, I was trying to figure out if I could definitively figure out what happened. So if you look at the album for A Hard Day's Night, you see that the music publishing goes to Unart Music, which is United Artists Music Publishing Company, on all of the songs in the film, including Tell Me Why, which wasn't in the film, but was going to be in the film. And you also know the soundtrack album is out on United Artists. And then when I was doing research, you'd read something in Billboard that would say, well, the soundtrack will be out on United Artists. And then something later on would say, well, it's not sure where the who has the soundtrack. And then I thought, okay, as a lawyer, here's what must have happened. United Artists signs a contract with the Beatles. And in the contract, it states they have the film, they have the American and Canadian soundtrack rights, North American rights, and split publishing. And the contract also says they have an option for 2 more films. Well, that's vague. Does that mean they have an option for 2 more films, and for each of those films, they have the soundtrack and the publishing? Or does it mean they just have the films and nothing else? So if I'm representing United Artists, I say, well, of course, we have the film and the same rights that attach to the film. If I'm representing Capitol and Macklin Music, I say, not so fast. All you have is the right to the film. We have that. So rather than litigate the matter, and they were getting close to a release date of the movie, they reached a compromise. And the compromise was that for the film Help, Capitol Records would get the soundtrack album. However, the song publishing would be split between Macklin and Unart Music. And then on the final album, Let It Be, if you look at the label on that, it's Macklin Music or Starling Music or Harris Songs. So the publishing for Let It Be, which is the 3rd film, I'll talk about that in a minute, that's the 3rd film under the contract. And so that means the publishing's there, but who has the soundtrack album? It's on an Apple label, and Capitol Records pressed those records, but they pressed them for United Artists, which was a distributor. So it flips for the final film. And that explains why the soundtracks and the publishing vary the way they do for all 3 films. Now, the other aha moment was that people for years had said that Yellow Submarine was the 3rd film under the United Artists contract.
Yeah.
And when you went in the theater, you saw that United Artists logo. And so that was a reasonable assumption. And even a couple of the people involved with the project on the cartoon side and others called it the 3rd film soundtrack. But I interviewed David Picker, who was president of United Artists at the time. And what David Picker said was they came to us with this and said, this is the 3rd film. And we said, no, it's a cartoon. And they said, well, the Beatles are in it at the end. And they said, yeah, for like about a minute and a half. No, you still owe us a film, but we'll be happy to distribute it. So Yellow Submarine, and if you look at the soundtrack album on it, that's on Capitol and Apple in the, on Capitol in the US, Parlophone in the UK, but on Apple labels. So that is not the 3rd film, in spite of what books and other things have said. The 3rd film is Let It Be, the 3rd and final film. And what Picker said was, by then, we knew there would be no Hard Day's Night Help. So we took the documentary.
You suggested maybe that there may not be another book in you at the moment. Is that correct? Do you feel like there is?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of, I started off doing a series of books on the different record labels in the United States. And I took a vacation from that to do The Beatles Are Coming, which we'll talk about later.
Yes, yes.
And then I said, okay, I'm done. And then Frank Daniels said, no, Bruce, you and I need to do a book on the British releases. And I said, no, somebody British needs to do it. And Frank said, yeah, but nobody is. So Frank and I did the book, The Beatles, records on Parlophone. And then I thought, okay, I'm done. And then when we hit the anniversary for Sgt. Pepper, and it was about, maybe 4 or 5 months away, and I had written this really good article that I was going to submit to either Goldmine or Beatle fan. And I said, in my mind, I'm a very visual person. I'm seeing the visuals that need to go with this article. And I know that neither Beatle fan nor Goldmine will do that. And
Mm.
I thought, to really give this thing justice, maybe I could put out my own magazine. And then I thought, I don't know a thing about publishing magazines, but I know how to publish a book. So I got the idea that I would do a book on Sergeant Pepper, and I wanted to do it from the fans' perspective. And so I also wanted to not only write about, what happened in the U.S. and the U.K., but what was happening in England, of course, and also Canada, and what was going on in the world in general, and also how the songs were written, recorded. And I did not have enough time to do that on my own. So I thought, literally, maybe I can get by with a little help from my friends. And so I contacted Al Sussman
Yeah.
and Frank Daniels and Bill King and Piers Hemmingson. And I said, could you guys help me out? Piers, could you write a chapter on Canada? Al, could you write about what was going on in the world? Bill, could you write about something from the fan perspective? And Frank, could you write about, the music of that era? And everyone agreed and everyone met the deadlines and got me everything in time. I worked with the same graphic designer and she had an idea. She said, Bruce, all your books are 9 by, 13
Ah,
or 12, 9 by 12. Why don't you make this one the size of an album? And I said, but 12 by 12 is going to be kind of, no, she said, no, no, not 12 by 12. Make it a little bit smaller. And so that's why, oh, okay. How about 9 by 9? And the next thing you know, we're doing that. Now, Diana Thornton is a very important part of these books. She's been my graphic designer on every book, all 17 of them,
wow.
and does fabulous work. And of course, kind of knows extremely well what I like and don't like. And she knows I like simple, uncluttered layouts.
Mm.
And, she's very good. Sometimes I'll get really stuck and I'll say, okay, Diana, I want these 3 images on this page, but I haven't a clue how to lay it out. And, then I'll get an email from her. You mean something like this? And I'm like, yes,
Yeah.
So I'm very fortunate to have, a partner like that to do the excellent graphic works because, the books have anywhere from 200 to 300 images, and all the images are either color or original black and white.
Mm.
And they're throughout the book. I always get frustrated when I'm reading a book and the only images are in the center of the book. I know that's cheaper for the printing, but I'm my own publisher. So if I want to spend more money doing the book right, I will. And that's the way I did it. I like to be able to, when I'm reading about something, if there's an image, I either want that image on that page or if it's a 2-page spread on one of the pages in that 2-page spread. And that is the case in almost every case in the book regarding images and text. It takes a lot of work and effort to get things to lay out that way. But I put the effort
Yeah.
in because my goal is I want to make a book that I myself would want to purchase.
Yes, and
And
go
that's
back
and I
to
figure if I do that, there'll be people out there who are going to want to buy that book.
yeah. I mean, your books do present beautifully, and that's something that's absolutely clear. I guess to find someone that can sense your visual nature like that so well is very rare because, as
Yeah,
you're saying, you tend to be a visual person yourself. To have someone that can
yeah,
instinctively interpret on your behalf must be very rare
yeah.
indeed.
No, it's been great. When we did the VJ book, we were naive and didn't know any better. And so I said, well, I want to do this book on VJ Records, and there's a Beatles convention in New Jersey in 9 months. So can we do it in 9 months? And she said, sure. And of course, there was no way possible to do it, yet we did.
Yeah, that's wonderful. What did you think, as a bit of a sidebar, about the Beatles anthology layout on the book? I remember when that came out being really excited by the epic scale of it
Hmm.
and
Yeah.
and just found it a chore to try and navigate some of the text through the image layout
Yeah.
on certain pages. I'm curious what your take was
Yeah.
from a visual perspective.
Yeah. I think sometimes artists get too busy.
Yeah,
And visually, it looks great, but they're showing a document, and I'm having trouble reading the document,
yeah.
and I want to know what the document says. And then I don't know if Anthology was guilty of this, but I know some of the Sergeant Pepper pages in the CD booklet are guilty of it, and that is black print on red. Now,
Yes.
granted, it was done on a 12 by 12 back album cover, and that's okay. But if you
Yes.
do it on a small surface, it's very difficult to read. And I always want to make sure that my customers can read the book. And so I avoid, printing, black on red and things like that. Sometimes I'll do a little bit different where I might have white print on a black background to really make a point about something.
Yeah.
But for the most part, I keep it pretty basic because, I want people to enjoy the book and I want them to be able to actually read the book.
I remember the first book that really impacted me, like many of my generation, second generation fans, visually, in terms of layout and the size of it, was Nicholas Schaffner's Beatles Forever. I just
Oh,
remember how
yeah.
striking the cover art was, the unique layout on the chapter headings. I remember the chapter,
Hmm.
The Color of Your Dreams. I go, oh, what a great idea that is. As a kid, I just found that book really visually did set a bar, didn't it?
It did. And, when I was doing my book, kind of the idea was that, okay, I want to do something that has the really good original research that Mark Lewison has been doing. And visually, I want that book to be visually exciting. I want to take the concept on those earlier books, which were about record releases, that Mark Walgren was doing in his book, where he went through each record and talked about how it charted and the three different charts and wrote a little bit about it, but expand that
Yeah.
significantly. And so, Mark Walgren's book, Wally and Harry's All Together Now, all those were kind of what I had going on in the back of my mind. When the book came out, a guy from one of the big publishing companies in New York came by. I was at the New Jersey Beatle Fest, and he walked up to me and he flipped through it and he said, 498 Productions. He said, is that a private imprint, like a self-published? And I said, yes. And he said, I knew it. And he says, now don't think I'm saying that because I'm insulting you. He says, I just know a regular publisher would not spend that kind of money on this type of book.
Huh.
So, and I took that as a compliment.
Yeah.
Uh, you know,
Absolutely. If we go right back to 2003, and I hope I have that year right, the Beatles are
hmm,
coming, the birth of Beatlemania in America.
yeah,
And I'd heard you once say that this might be one of your personal favorites.
yeah.
And I'm wondering, is that because it perhaps connects to that boy in the bus? I'm just curious about why that book particularly sits well with you.
It was a very exciting time. And I'd read things about that time, and there was a lot of misinformation in it. And what I wanted to do was learn for myself why what happened, and also be able to share that knowledge with others. And in the book, I was very fortunate to be able to interview, three of my childhood heroes. And people think, oh my God, did you interview George and Paul and Ringo? And I say, no, I interviewed Mike Wallace. I interviewed, Walter Cronkite. I interviewed Edwin Newman, who were three of the seminal journalists in the United States in the 1960s and 70s. And to me, that really meant a lot to me that I could interview these journalists because I felt that even unwittingly as it may have been, the press was an important part of the story that fueled Beatlemania in America.
Yes.
The press would cover things because it was a great story. If you loved the Beatles and their freshness and all, you wanted to write about it. And if you hated the Beatles, you wanted to write about it and make fun of it. So it got tremendous press coverage. And I really enjoyed going back and seeing it. One of the fun things that I had about the book was I had gone back and read some columns that were written by Dr. Joyce Brothers, who was what we would call, I guess, a pop psychiatrist, where she would, explain different phenomena and was, well-known columnist on psychiatry. And she wrote two columns on why the little girls love the Beatles. And so I kind of poked fun of it when I wrote it. And, I had a good time doing it, kind of poking fun at it and in a good natured way. And then in the 2-page spread where I talked about it and had a picture of it with the Beatles, I had a quote from George Harrison saying, psychiatrists are a menace, George Harrison. And I thought, okay, it's cute. And then all of a sudden, shortly after the book comes out, I find myself in New York City on a panel with Dr. Joyce Brothers.
Wow.
And I showed her the 2-page spread and she read it and she said, did I really write that? And I said, yes, you did. And she was laughing and she says, oh, this is really cool. And, she really enjoyed it. She and I hit it off great. The photographer for whoever was taking pictures there took a bunch of pictures with me. And then when she died a year or two later, all the obits and things had pictures of her with me because that was really the last set of pictures taken of her.
Yeah.
And so I was at all these newspapers and different things with my picture with her when she died. But she
Yeah.
was a really cool lady, and she was not offended at all that I was poking fun at her, and she understood where I was coming from with it, and really cool lady, and I really was very fortunate to meet her. That's the great thing about the Beatles. You meet all these great people. I mean, I'm meeting you through the Beatles. I'm not meeting
Yeah.
you through anything else.
Yeah.
And that to me is a wonderful thing about it. I've met some wonderful reporters and journalists through the Beatles. I met just wonderful everyday people
Yeah.
through the Beatles. And then some of them, when I met them, they were everyday people, and now they're much more like, say, Tom Frangione. I meet Tom at Beatlefest, and he's a Beatles nerd, and I'm a Beatles nerd, and all of a sudden, Tom's got 4 or 5 shows he's associated with on the Beatles channel. So
Yeah.
it's wonderful to see things like that. Or Al Sussman, another wonderful guy I met. Wally, Bill King, Mark Lapidus, who runs Beatlefest,
Of course.
and just Beatle fans. I've
Yeah.
made so many friends through these Beatle festivals. There's a woman, Karen Duchek, who is from Chicago, and I'm like a rookie compared to her. She's been going to Beatle Fest a lot. My first one was like in 1996, I think.
Yeah.
But there are people that have been going since the 1980s. And she said, I first started going to Beatle conventions so I could look at and buy stuff. We didn't have eBay then. So if you wanted to get this Beatles stuff, you had to get it somewhere. And then she said she started going to listen to the guests because the guests were really good and special. And then she said, now I go to be with my friends.
Ah, that's beautiful.
And I thought that was just a wonderful summation of things.
Yeah. I think I've said this before on the pod. In my time, to your point, I've met some wonderful people sitting and talking to you, like you say, out of a shared love. And what I find again and again is Beatle people are good people. I just find that
Yeah.
sat and spoke with Charles Rose now. I'm sure you know Charles.
Oh, God. Yeah. Another
Yeah.
wonderful guy.
And the moment we started speaking, it was like we'd always been speaking. And then I'm sure that's
Yeah.
Charles.
Yeah.
I'm sure that's Charles as he is, for people.
Yeah.
And when we got to the end of it, he had this line. We finished it. He said, "Hey man, I love talking to you. I reckon if we were growing up as kids and coming up at the same time, we would have been buddies. We would have hung out. We would have been friends. And
Yeah.
and I believed him. And I thought I think we would have been. And again
Oh,
and
there's no
again,
doubt. Yeah.
you find that Beatle people tend to be good people. I spoke with
Oh, yeah.
a musician the other week who I'd never met, a fellow in our last episode, Gabriel Vargas, who's just released a single called Eleanor Rigby's Ghost, and a wonderful guy. And similarly, by the end of it, it was like, hey, next time I'm out touring, we should catch up. I'd love to sit and have a conversation with you. I think there's something that he pointed out that taps into that. He made the comment that part of the uniqueness of the Beatles is those themes within their story, within the music: hope, love, understanding,
Yeah.
peace, life flowing on within you and without you, these deep ideas. They're not locked into one generation. Those themes are so human
They're not.
that they translate from one generation to another generation. So it's not so much about just a hook and a melody as it is about those very human values.
Yeah. No, the music is indeed timeless, and I mean, you mentioned, and look, David Bedford out of Liverpool, another wonderful guy, Jude Kessler. I mean, it's
Lovely.
just so many people that you meet, and David and Jude are, excellent authors who have put out plenty of books themselves.
Yes, I've spoken with
Just,
Jude, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, just really great people. And that's so exciting about it. And, it's like a second extended family.
Yeah, absolutely. If I jump ahead, you have sat down with a number of people and had these wonderful conversations. Am I right? Sir George Martin is also in the mix?
Yeah, briefly, I've never had like an hour conversation with Sir George, but I did have some conversations with him, and some very memorable ones, and had a good conversation with Sir George and his son Giles at the Love Show press conference, and Love Show premiere and things like that. So, I really enjoyed chatting with them. And the thing when you're talking to Giles he sounds a lot like his father. So, if you close your eyes, you think you're talking to his dad sometimes. But, once again, wonderful person, and, really enjoy talking to him. I wish I could have spent more time with Sir George, but
Yeah.
the brief times I did spend with him, to me, it was very special. There's something, you just really think, well, how fortunate I am. I mean, to me, being able to interview somebody, out of the Beatles world like Walter Cronkite to me was a really
Yeah.
big deal.
Yeah.
And because my family, we had a little portable TV that would, sometimes be in the kitchen when my mom was cooking, or would roll it into the dining room when we were having dinner, and we would watch the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite. So, to grow up with someone like him and be able to interview him. And he's a great interview. He was funny. He'd say, well, I hope you're not offended by this, but I was not a Beatlemaniac by any means. And I said, well, Mr. Cronkite, that doesn't offend me at all, but what type of music is your favorite? And he says, well, Dixieland jazz. And I said, well, Mr. Cronkite, I'm from New Orleans, so why would that bother me? I said, that's great. And I mean, and he and I had a great interview. He agreed to do the forward to the book, and he was going to be in New Orleans for a conference at the World War II Museum and be the keynote speaker. And unfortunately, the event got canceled because Hurricane Katrina hit New
Mm.
Orleans a month before that event was scheduled. And and it would have been incredible because he and his chief of staff, we were going to take him out to dinner at my favorite New Orleans restaurant, Galatoire's, and then bring him to hear Dixieland Jazz at Preservation Hall.
Wow.
And what an evening that would have been. But oh well, I still was fortunate enough to be able to interview him by phone.
Yeah. I'm just curious. Cronkite was obviously such a huge part of the American story
Yeah.
and a larger than life figure. When you're in the company or even in a conversation with people of that stature that obviously loom large in your own life, how do you ground yourself when you're having those conversations? And do you find that once you do get grounded, you're just talking to people?
Well, I think as an attorney,
Yeah.
I got over I'm talking to, this famous judge or whatever, so I really, I didn't feel overwhelmed talking to Mr. Cronkite, but I did have a kind of an awkward situation. And that was prior to interviewing him. And I knew from talking to his chief of staff, I was the first person that got through the gate that was going to talk to him on the Beatles' 40th anniversary because she knew that as they got close to the anniversary, there would be several interviews. And since I was doing a book, I needed to interview him more in advance. So I watched this DVD, Cronkite Remembers. And in it, I referred to and I told Mr. Cronkite I had watched it. And I said, in the video, you mentioned that Ed Sullivan had learned about the Beatles from a broadcast on the CBS Evening News. And he says, yes, yes, that's correct. And I said, Mr. Cronkite, in all due respect, that is not correct. And rather than, who the heck do you think
Yeah.
you are? I'm Walter effing Cronkite. He
Yeah.
was, oh, why do you say that? And then I presented the facts in chronological order that made it clear that that was not the case. That Ed Sullivan had met with Brian Epstein prior to that broadcast on the CBS Evening News. And after I explained all the facts, Mr. Cronkite said, yes, yes, I see your point. He says, but I distinctly remember getting off the set on December 10, as you're telling me. And right after we broadcast this story on the Beatles, I get a call from Ed and he says, Walter, what can you tell me about these bugs or whatever they call themselves? And I said, Mr. Cronkite, I don't doubt for a second that that happened exactly as you remember, but you've misinterpreted the call.
Huh.
I said, here's what happened. Ed Sullivan on November 11 and 12 meets with Brian Epstein and he books the Beatles. He knows he's taking a chance because they're relatively unknown in America. And then a month later, he's in his suite at the Monica Hotel watching the CBS Evening News, and you end your broadcast with a 4+ minute story on the Beatles. He gets all excited and he calls you up about that. And I said, and Mr. Sullivan was very bad with names. And Mr. Cronkite laughed and he said, yes, he was. And he said, thank you for explaining that to me. And so, I felt good because, it wasn't a case of some obnoxious person who was upset because I was correcting him. Instead, He wanted to get to the truth because that was more important than his ego and being correct. And
And
so,
yeah,
me, that as much as I respected Mr. Cronkite before the interview,
yeah,
that much
yeah.
more after the interview.
And they often say, don't meet your heroes, but there's those rare moments when it's an absolute wonderful thing to meet them. And it sounds like
Yeah,
that's what he was for you.
absolutely. Same thing with talking on the phone to Mike Wallace and Edward Newman.
Yeah,
Really, I mean, they were just wonderful people, and everyone was just very complimentary about the book. And when you hear journalists
yeah.
telling you the book's very well researched and well written, that means a lot.
On that point, when you look back at the body of work, because it is quite sprawling, you can see my man cave business here behind me, and
Yeah.
I have a lot of your books in a section over here. So your name has always been around for me over
uh,
the years, as it has been for many other Beatles fans,
yeah.
no doubt about it. That's why this moment for me is really special too. What do you hope is the legacy of the body of work? Because it is a wonderful contribution into Beatles authorship unto itself. What do you hope that those books go on to do?
Well, I hope that, not only the people of the first generation and the second and third generations, but future generations who want to learn about the Beatles, how the songs were written and recorded, how they were received by the press at the time, because my books are very focused on that. I'm not interested, in Revolver or Abbey Road being voted as, the best rock album ever by different magazines recently. I mean, I'm proud of that, obviously, but what I want to know is, what did people think about Revolver when it first came out?
Yeah.
What did people think of Abbey Road when it first came out, and things like that? And that's why I have those fan recollections where first, second, and third generation fans write into me, and I publish, their recollections. Sound just what it is. And all the books, all 9 books in the Beatles album series have that section in the book. And some people tell me, it's their favorite section in the book because they know most of the facts.
Yes.
And, but what they don't know is the stories behind it. I mean, when the first book came out, I did not realize how many people bonded with their parents over Sergeant Pepper.
Huh.
Who knew? Be a parent came home, and the father would come home and he was very much against rock music, and their kids were playing Sergeant Pepper, and he was and then the next day came home and he was like, can you play that 1964 song again, or 60 when I'm 64,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
things like that. So I mean, that was the cool thing about it, that people bonded. Who knew? I didn't bond with my parents over Sergeant Pepper,
Yeah.
so it was really cool to read things like that.
Yeah.
And some of them I'd read and I'd say, yeah, that's the way it was for me.
Yeah.
And others I'd read and say, no, it wasn't that way for me, but that's interesting that that person had that reaction.
Yeah.
So I think, by putting those fan recollections together, I think that what is doing a service for people down the road, because they'll get a feel for what did common everyday people think. Plus musicians, when I did it, I was very fortunate that uh, someone was able to set me up with an interview with Billy Joel.
Wow.
And, and when I interviewed Billy about certain, I said, well, first of all, another terrific guy. I mean, it was almost comical the way it started. I'm talking to him, and I said, Billy, I really enjoyed your concert in New Orleans, 4 months ago or whatever it was. He says, oh, wow, you went to my concert? And I felt like saying, no, why would I want to go to Billy Joel in my hometown, you idiot? But no,
Yeah.
I mean, he was so humble. It's like,
Yeah.
oh, you went to my concert. That's really cool. And I said, I really just have one question, and it'll have an expanded answer, I know, but I want to know, what was your reaction the first time you heard Sergeant Pepper? And
Mm.
he says, well, nobody ever asked me
Yeah.
that before. And he tells the story, and it was an incredible story. So, I mean, I was very fortunate, for that. Another one where I also knew someone who knew Peter Tork of the Monkees. And I asked her, could you see if Peter would write something for the book? She had written something for the book. Can you get Peter to write something? And so I was getting near deadline, and I called her up, and she was on vacation, and says, oh, I'm so sorry. It slipped my mind completely. She says, I'll go ahead and shoot him an email now. And so she shoots him an email, and I hear back from her about 20 minutes later, expecting her to say, well, Bruce, Peter said he'll do it, or Peter doesn't have the time, or whatever. She says in the email, it says, here's what Peter wrote. And I was like, oh my God, he wrote it from the heart because he wrote it in 20 minutes, and,
Yeah.
it's just stuff like that, just
Yeah.
incredible things like that.
I think what you're tying into there is that shared common humanity when people can almost
Yeah.
see themselves in those stories. I was telling someone the other day, the first time I heard Revolver, I would have been about 8 or 9, and I was playing, and my father introduced me to a lot of music, and we were listening to it. It's one of my favorite core memories. And Eleanor Rigby
Mm-hmm.
came on, and I can still remember my father excitedly watching me react to it. We're sitting in the lounge room, and only a kid, and he looked at me and he
Yeah.
goes, listen to that, that's poetry, that's poetry. And I'm thinking,
Yeah.
I don't understand what's poetry. But as I got older, I thought, oh, what a beautiful memory of Dad
Yeah.
asking his son to almost listen a little deeper. And again, the power of the music. And I think when readers go into those moments in your books, they see themselves in there. I'm sure that's
Yes.
what it is. I
Yeah. It's one of the things that I really enjoy putting those sections together.
Yeah, I was really blessed years ago. I had a very small window of time speaking with Glenn Shorrock of the Little River Band, and
Hmm.
I worked in entertainment for a little while, and we'd hired him to play at a venue, and we were backstage and we were talking Beatles, and he told me the story of being at Abbey Road in 1967, and he was recording with the Twilights, Needle in a Haystack, and all these other tracks, and years before, obviously, Little River Band, and in the studio next door were the Beatles, and it was Paul and George. And he said, we were in the studio next door recording, and we looked up, and Paul was in the control room, and he had a cup of tea in his hand, and he just looked up and listened to the playback and gave a thumbs up. And we were all like, oh, it's Paul, it's Paul. But then he jumped on mic and said, hey, lads, when you've got a break, pop next door, I'll let you hear something. And he said, we were giddy. And he was telling me, you got to remember, Michael, these guys were gods on earth at that time. And it was happening. It wasn't history. And we went next door and he ushered us in. And we passed George in the control room, and Paul brought us down to the piano. And he played them Penny Lane, unaccompanied by anything else, just on the piano. And he said, I can still remember we're sort of leaning around the piano and he sang Penny Lane to us. And he said, that was a memory I'll cherish for the rest of my life.
Oh my
Yeah,
God,
just
yes.
incredible.
It is. I wish I had memories like that. I'm blessed with the ones I have, of course. So, and a lot of my friends have had wonderful memories of, meeting a Beatle and all. And it's so much fun always to hear their stories.
Yeah, I won't bore you now, but I've got a towel wrapped up over here under glass that Ringo threw to me at 2013's concert here in Brisbane. I was in the second row singing at the top of my lungs, and he did an Elvis, went off stage during Give Peace a Chance. Todd Rundgren's on stage, and the All Stars, and he comes out and I'm in his eye line, and as he's singing, he takes off the towel, and he looks at me and nods and throws it to me, not randomly out into the audience. I grab it. They finish the song, the lights come up, and I had some friends behind me who were rallying around me. I can't believe that. And I kid you not, it was pure euphoria. I was outside of my body looking
Yeah.
down on myself.
Yeah.
And I said to someone, tears in my eyes, I said, it's really hard to describe. I've been looking at that face and those eyes since I was 8 years old in photographs, in books, and on album covers. And for just 5, 6 seconds, the eyes lock, and here's a towel, and I wept like a baby. I got in the car, and one of those life moments that people will say, "Can I touch the towel?" I say, if you don't mind, the last bits of DNA on there are Ringo Starr and me. I want to keep it intact.
Yeah. Maybe if you live long enough, you'll be able to clone another Ringo from it.
Hey,
You never know.
there you go. Stranger things have happened. I appreciate all your time. If we did have a bit of fun toward the end here, I'd love
Yes,
you to
indeed.
let me know if you could do this for me. Your desert island choices, if you had to call
Okay,
it,
sure.
and I know it can change on any given day.
Right.
You're off to a desert island, one Beatles album only. What would it be?
The White Album, not just because it's a double album, but it is my favorite album. It's not their best album, but it's my favorite.
Great answer. It's my favorite too, and it would be the one that I take. I fall in love with that every time I listen to it. It just keeps delivering layers, doesn't it? Yeah.
Yes.
One solo album can go with you. What is it?
Oh boy. I'm going to go with All Things Must Pass.
Yeah, terrific. Any particular reason for that one?
When it came out, I was blown away because I knew from Abbey Road that George had really blossomed into a really good songwriter, and All Things Must Pass validated that for me. And so many songs that I love on it, Let It Down, Let It Roll. I mean, just so many,
Yeah,
of course, My Sweet Lord, uh, and just little moments on it, like Hear Me, Lord, where it's got
yeah.
this one with the songs going on, and then all of a sudden it goes above and below.
You
It's just
hit it.
like one of the reviewers said, it's like someone opened the door to a church where gospel music was happening, and then the door shuts again. Just so many fun little adventurous things about that album.
Yeah, the moment you said that, I got tingles because I remember hearing that album for the first time and that shift
Yeah,
in the gears and got tingles.
yeah.
They were the masters of these little surprises
Oh,
somewhere in the
yeah.
middle to kind of take you out and then bring you back. That's a great,
Yeah, it's
great.
like Ringo's sneaky little drumming. You're listening to him, and all of a sudden, out of nowhere, he does a sneaky little fill, and you're like, "Whoa, where'd that come from?"
Yes, yes, 100%. So well said. And what book would you take?
Well, can I take one of mine? No, I would take the expanded edition of Mark Lewison's Tune In book.
Yeah, great. I know.
The expanded edition. After all, I'm on a desert island.
Oh, well said. If you could take one of yours, would it be the one we spoke of earlier with The Beatles Are Coming? Would that be the one?
Yeah, it'd probably be The Beatles Are Coming, or it could also be The Beatles Rubber Soul Revolver, because I really like that book too.
Yeah.
I mean, I like all the books. It's like asking a parent, who's your favorite kid? Except I have 17 of them. That's kind of crazy.
Yeah, great
But
response. Uh,
yeah,
Bruce, where should people find you if they wanted to discover more of your world online and dig in?
my website's dead easy. It's just Beatle.net, Net. So very easy website. There are articles on there. There are things you can download for free, such as some of the books I've done supplements to. And whether or not you buy the book, you can download the digital supplement to it for free and things like that. If you haven't checked out any of my books out there, by all means check them out. And we make all the books in the Beatles album series are available in PDF format. And that's a good way, particularly if you're like, say, all the way in Australia and you
Yeah.
go, I'd really like to get his book, but the shipping is so expensive.
Yes.
But then again, maybe Amazon Australia has it, check and see,
Yeah.
uh, for that. But also, look, I love to hold a book in my hand,
Yeah.
but digital books are kind of cool too. You get really good images. They look great on a computer. They look really good on an iPad, and if you're, off on an airplane trip somewhere, like say you're flying from London to
Yeah.
Australia, get a couple of those books, a PDF file, and you can read them on the plane and you won't be lugging around a stack of heavy books.
Yeah.
Although we did conduct an experiment because people kept complaining about how heavy my books were. And we found that if you downloaded all of my books on an iPad, it does not make the iPad any heavier. So it's scientifically proved.
I think I felt that curveball leaving your hand as you're coming in with that. Bruce, it's been a real honor. This has been a great
Likewise.
conversation. It's a wonderful body of work to have in the
Thank
world.
you.
And thank you so much for the opportunity to sit and talk a little with you here on episode 50. And I look forward to whatever else is coming down the road ahead.
Well, thank you. And you don't have to wait 50 episodes to have me back.
Yeah, would love to do that, sir. Thank you so
Okay.
much, Bruce.
You're welcome.
All
Take
the
care
best.
now.